Good morning. Welcome to the June 22nd Flyleaf conversation. My name is Catherine McKee. I'm an assistant editor in the publications office, and we have three fantastic guests with us today to discuss their work. So as an introduction, would you three guests please introduce yourselves and describe who you are and where you work within the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Mary Beth, we'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Mary Beth Fitz. I'm an assistant state archaeologist with the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. I have a review area that's in the eastern Piedmont region of North Carolina. So that's Wake County and Johnston County, all the way up to Northampton. And I review projects, mostly for their impacts on archaeological sites. And I also answer questions that anyone out there you might have about archaeology in that eastern Piedmont region. I also review National Register nominations to see what types of archaeological resources might be associated with those important places that get listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And I direct archaeological research projects on state lands. My office often works with state historic sites and state parks and other land managing organizations, and occasionally there's a need for us to assist them with archaeological projects. So that's some of what I do, in addition to the projects that we're going to talk about today, the hurricane grant projects.
Fantastic, thank you. Melissa, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, my name is Melissa Timo, and I am the Historic Cemetery Specialist for the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. My job involves helping to record cemeteries for the North Carolina Site File, our registry of archaeological and historic sites, as well as assist people, whether they be citizens or consultants, answer or figure out cemetery questions or historic preservation issues. And I get to dabble with a lot of things across the entire state, including these hurricane grants that we have along our coastal area.
Thank you. And Alison, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Alison Rock. I am the Historic Preservation Archaeological Specialist with the Office of State Archaeology. I was brought in specifically to work on these hurricane grant projects. So helping manage, helping plan, helping, spread the information about what we're finding and the impacts of hurricanes on archaeological resources. So hopefully we can tell you more about that today.
Great. So now that we know who you are, I'd like to discuss what you do. Mary Beth, could you introduce some of your projects that you work on, specifically the Nearshore Survey?
Absolutely. And I'm going to actually share my screen so I can show you some images that kind of go along with what I'll be talking about. Hopefully you can see. Awesome. So these the Shorescape Survey that we're received grant funding to undertake is kind of this part of a long-term planning effort, really, that our office is doing, because we need to address the fact that archaeological sites along the coast are damaged, and they're continuing to be damaged, particularly during storm events, which there's a lot of energy associated with these storms, as anyone who's been along the coast when they happen know, and that energy gets, impacts the coastal, and the result is various types of erosion, and unsettling of materials, most obviously. So these pictures are just showing you kind of that happening. They're from 2008, and undoubtedly additional impacts have already happened to this stretch of coast. So what are the survey work that we're planning we're calling it the Shorescape Survey, and it's a weird word, but what it's meant to do is address the fact that we're talking both about the shoreline, but also taking a landscape approach. So when we think about landscapes, we're talking about a big picture perspective. So looking not just, say, at a farmhouse, maybe, but also the entire, all the outbuildings associated with the farm, and actually the farm fields and pastures. So that thinking of the farm, you know, in that perspective, or as the slide is showing you, Town Creek Indian Mound State Historic Site, you know, we're not just looking at the mound itself, but also the village that surrounded it, and, you know, the waterway it was located next to, the plateau it was built on. Looking at that, like at that scale, helps us understand how all the different elements of that community worked, how the people use the landscape, and how all those different little aspects of kind of daily life fit together. So for the Shorescape survey, we wanted to look at not just at the intertidal, where the land and the water meet, which is the, you know, the shoreline, what people typically think of as the shoreline, but then also inland and underwater, because there's archaeological sites on the land and underwater. And we wanted to focus on communities that were underrepresented in our records. And so that often is actually African-American historic sites and archaeological resources, and industrial sites, especially for underwater and intertidal resources. Underwater archaeologists have tended to focus on shipwrecks, for example. We do have a lot of shipwrecks recorded, but some of the types of things you see in this image, like the kind of the wharves and the piers for the buildings that are supporting these buildings, we haven't done as good of a job as documenting. So we're hoping with this work to do that. And you can see that this whole fishing village couldn't exist without those architectural elements. So, and here's just a couple of slides to give you an example of what some of these archaeological sites actually look like. So on this one slide, you're seeing some slabs of wood sticking out of grass, basically in the marsh. Those are the remains of a platform that would have been built across a dike at the edge of a marsh, a rice field. So this is in Brunswick County, kind of near the Cape Fear River. Another example would be a tar kiln. This is in the Croatan National Forest, kind of showing you some of what an industrial site would look like. So what the survey work is going to do is it's basically archaeologists are going to go out and document coastal resources 60 meters inland, which is about 200 feet. It's essentially the amount of a square acre, basically, or how, if you had a square acre of land, you know, that far inland and then that far outward, at a minimum, we might go a little further than that. And then all the information we get back about all these historic places, we're going to use that information to create planning documents, you know, figuring out what to do next, how to monitor these places, and figure out how at risk they are from storms, and then also create educational resources having to do with these places. And as I mentioned, you know, focusing on African-American communities and maritime industries. Oh, and I'm gonna stop sharing for now, because that's kind of a summary of what our work is right now on that project.
Thank you. Melissa, what sort of projects are you working on right now?
Sure. It sort of builds off this similar ideas that Mary Beth just spoke about, looking at but obviously from my title, we're gearing it towards cemeteries instead. Now there's a lot of old communities that have been have been along the North Carolina coast for centuries. And some of the cemeteries are documented, others are not. And these tend to be smaller rural cemeteries and those associated with African American communities, especially pre-emancipation sort of enslaved communities. And these type of resources look a little bit different, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And they weren't recorded as frequently as some of the bigger or big plantation owning family cemeteries were. And this is important to do not only because these things that used to be sort of rural are popping up more and more as the state develops, but oftentimes, especially when you look at enslaved communities, the cemeteries are placed on sort of marginal areas where the land wasn't very useful. And there are lots of records, some interesting stories that were recorded stating that in the 18th and 19th centuries, some of these cemeteries were already flooding because they were put on land that just wasn't any good. So at this point, we want to know what's surviving, what they look like, and by documenting these cemeteries, then we'll be able to help land managers, because our projects are geared towards state-owned and managed properties, help these state land managers develop management plans for long-term care and historic preservation of these sites. Because it's good to know where they are, it's good to know how they're being impacted, and it also will be helpful for communities and descendants to know where they are. Sometimes they lose track of where a cemetery is, especially if the land owner has changed over time and now it's a big state park or a big wildlife area, that here it is, here are the people I can visit, and that just sort of builds the relationship between our communities and our state agencies as well. So it's very similar, and it may overlap a little bit with some of the work that's done on the shore, but that's on purpose, is because we want to get the best idea about what life was like over the past centuries along North Carolina's coast, to have the wonderful knowledge and to help protect these sites going forward as best as we can.
As a follow-up to that, do you anticipate that there are a number of cemeteries along the shoreline, or do you expect that they're further inland?
I would almost certainly believe that there are, looking, because there are, like, we can't, there are patterns in where people put cemeteries. I already mentioned the enslaved communities were often pushed into sort of marginal lands, but also the idea of an overlook, having the cemetery on sort of a prominent place, might be on an overlook, a bluff overlooking the water, and the bluff isn't doing so well these days because of erosional issues, and other situations where rivers have moved or things like that. So there are things that may have been put along the coast on purpose because of views and land availability. There are other cemeteries that more than likely started out further inland, but now are closer to the shore. And those are the ones we're really concerned about as well, because there just was not planning for that, but now we have to develop plans in order to take care of all of these places.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Alison, what sort of projects are you working on?
Well, I have just been supporting these two. So I'm going to share my screen to give you some visuals on what the first steps of these projects have been. So we've started by first, as Melissa mentioned, we're working primarily in state lands that are managed and operated. We've started by trying to figure out where all these lands are. And in the coastal counties, there were a fair bit within the counties we're working on, which are all of the ones that are in red outlined here. And from that, we then went through and pulled out where that state lands were. So in this map, it's all of the blue areas, or essentially where we identified properties that we could look at within the grant that we, the project we're working on. And so with that, we then move forward to see how these lands were impacted by hurricanes, particularly from the 2018 season, which was Florence and Michael. And this was important because the grant was funded, or the projects were funded primarily for this hurricane impact. We intend to look at other impacts of the changing landscape and sea level rise and stuff like that. But with it primarily being based around hurricanes, we wanted to look at that. And Florence and Michael, we'll talk about in a minute, but they were the two largest storms in the last few years. Obviously, Hurricane Dorian came in 2019, which was just as bad. But in this case, we were looking at Florence and Michael. Florence made landfall in this area, and then Michael blew up from the western side of the state, but still caused a lot of flooding in the coastal counties. So we picked a Category 4 storm to account for both of those storms to look at the inland flooding. And this is just a map like giving you a general idea of where this flooding was happening and how far inland in some cases this flooding was going, which extended our reach into some of these inner counties that may not be right on the shoreline like you think. We also looked at what the land was underneath. So harder rocks are are harder to erode than sands and muddy sediments along shorelines. So we wanted to know which shorelines are more easily moved by water movement and flooding. And then we put the lands over it to see where they lined up. And from that, we picked a number of areas that were high probability for having like erosion and impact by the sites. So you can see these red areas, most of which are along the shoreline, but there are a few inland. The yellow is the next priority level, and there's some of the larger spaces that we are potentially going to work in. With that in mind, knowing that these areas were also heavily utilized throughout our history for maritime industries and communities, we then collated all of this historical research and information about where these places were by looking at maps to plot out plantations, to plot out lumber fields, and where like longleaf pines were grown historically, so that we could say, well, they likely milled here. Or they had a naval stores plant here to cut down these trees to get tar. Rice fields have already been mentioned, and shipbuilding and fishing industries. They're a little more vague on exactly where people had set up fishing communities, but we know they were set up. We know the same thing with shipbuilding yards. Most historic maps just say there's a shipbuilder in this general vicinity, and the words take up like most of the map, and you're like, okay, that's really helpful, but we know that there's likely something on that waterway, so we included that as well as our previously recorded archaeological sites. We wanted to know what we already know and where that is in relation to places that are being impacted. So with that, we then overlaid all of this information to figure out this is where we should focus our energies for this specific project. Now, we hope in the future to continue this work and explore some of these other areas. But this is what we've ended up with the Shorescape. We have about 12 areas that we're anticipating to look at. For the cemeteries, I think it's another like 10. So about 20 areas that we hope to go explore for the cemetery work. And they're all tied together with this environmental priority and this historical priority to say, hey, there could be something here, and it's likely going to be impacted or has been impacted with these previous storms. So with that.
That's really interesting and looks like a lot of use of maps and GIS data.
It definitely was.
Yes. Alison, could you describe the grant program that assists and supports your work?
Yeah, so I'll start with the hurricanes, which really fed into this, and then I'll turn it over to Mary Beth to get in onto the nitty gritty. of it. But so this is a program that's funded by the National Park Service. It's the Emergency Supplemental Historic Preservation Program. It's a mouthful, but so this funds usually comes out after storms. So in this case, for 2018, it was Hurricane Florence, Michael, and the typhoon in the Pacific that impacted the Northern Mariana Islands. And so it was opened up to states across the Southeast and communities across the Southeast to work towards protecting and preserving and understanding the impacts on the cultural heritage resources in the area. So Florence, as we all know, made landfall in Lake Brunswick County, had blown up to a category 5. And by the time it made landfall, it was a category 1 or 2. I have it wrong. I think it was a 1. But it was still very devastating, and it caused significant inland flooding. New Bern was completely underwater. There were a bunch of other communities that were underwater for a long period of time. I've seen pictures of I-40 just flooded. So lots of resources that may or may not have been impacted by this storm that we're still trying to figure out. Michael, on the other hand, came ashore as a category 5 in Florida, completely devastated the towns that it crossed. And as it made its way up the Southeast, it curved out towards the Atlantic and crossed right over North Carolina. By that point, I think it's a category 1 or a high tropical storm, and dumped lots of rain throughout the western part of the state and the Piedmont, and still had enough wind and energy when it got to the coastal areas to also cause a lot of flooding and significantly high tides along the shores. So along with North Carolina, a bunch of other states also received these fundings to look at these impacts. So Mary Beth can explain more about the nitty-gritty of those projects.
Sure. And I don't, yeah, I don't know about nitty-gritty, but I can share some information with folks about how to find out more nitty-gritty details if they want to. So yeah, as Alison mentions, it's the Emergency Supplemental Historic Preservation Fund, or ESHPF. Federal program, and as we know, the feds like acronyms. So it is a mouthful, but essentially what happened after the hurricanes is that there were some leaders from the various state historic preservation office, including North Carolina's, that kind of explained the need for funds to help historic properties that were affected by the hurricanes. And Congress, in response, appropriated $50 million for this fund, and it was for the eligible states were Alabama, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, the Northern Mariana Islands, South Carolina, and Virginia. All those places had FEMA disaster declarations. So that was kind of one of the, to be eligible for these grants, that was one of the criteria, was that the county in which the historic place was located had to have a FEMA declaration issued. So that, and otherwise a place had to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places or eligible to be listed. So that just, those were kind of the criteria, but otherwise, most of the funds that were allocated to North Carolina have already actually been granted to a variety of nonprofits. And it's going to show. Sure. So here they are, nonprofits and local governments. And this kind of shows you both all of the counties that were eligible, and kind of you can get a sense of how widespread the destruction, and impacts were of these hurricanes, because you can see it's not just the coast, it's all the way inland through the Piedmont, and even some of our mountain counties had disaster declarations. So about just over $9 million in grant awards have already been granted to these projects, mostly for repairing historic buildings, but also some of the projects are in the nature of doing surveys and planning, which is similar to our the grant funded work that we're doing. So yeah, you can, I put the link on the previous slide to where you can find more information about this, or you might be easier just to Google ESHPF and North Carolina, and you'll find all this stuff.
Great, thank you. So we have all this background information on what you're doing and that sort of thing, but so what? So how do hurricanes impact archaeological sites and cemeteries?
I'll take stab at the archaeology. So as Mary Beth has shown in some of the pictures and images of previous sites, we can see there's a lot of erosion. So with hurricanes, you're getting lots of water energy moving through, lots of wind coming in, lots of rain. And the storm surges are overtopping rivers with the rain adding more water. The ground's already being too saturated. So you've just got all this energy that's being pushed back up rivers or pushed towards like the sound sides of barrier islands. And as this water is moving across the landscape and parallel to these shorelines, against these shorelines, you have a bunch of sediment movement. And that sediment with it may be taking artifacts and portions of sites that are located on the coastline or on that shoreline. And so you can see in some of the images that Mary Beth showed, the significant like cliff erosion, and particularly the one at the rice field where the marsh was like on top of that platform structure. Everything underneath that had been eroded out. So as that erosion continues, those wood timbers may start to collapse, and they may start to fall down. And change the context of the site and their location in that site. And within that change, it changes our ability to interpret it as it was. The winds can knock down trees. I remember the first storm that I went through as a kid growing up in Chapel Hill. We just had trees down all over our yard. So as giant trees are pulling down and they're pulling their root structures out, they're also moving sites that may be near them, or their roots may have extended into an archaeological site. And as that tree falls down, that root's coming up and it's pushing over stuff. It's moving artifacts, it's moving walls, and causing sites to fall over and collapse. You want to get super technical, there's probably lots of things we also still don't know how these sites are being impacted at a chemical level by the significant inundation of salt water being pushed up into some of these rivers and some of these lowland areas that may not have been there before. And if it's sitting there for a while, that salt can cause problems. And a lot of these sites on the inland side that have been flooded. We saw in those maps that the flooding was going fairly far inland. They've never been exposed to water. And so as water seeps in at that level, and that water then evaporates, that's changing the structure, the interior structure, particularly like wood, that may cause it as it to dry out to kind of disintegrate and break down and collapse. So there's lots of things that we can visibly see with the like erosion of sites along shorelines, but I think there's still a lot of stuff that we're still trying to figure out what's exactly happening on a more chemical level to some of these resources. Now the underwater sites are interesting because we do know that they can also be impacted. A lot of people, don't think about hurricanes impacting shipwrecks to the same degree that they impact shorelines, because you can see that evidently. You walk out, something's gone. but you can't really see that underwater. But we've known from several other studies that the wave energy that's coming in with these giant storms is moving across the bottom, and once they get to shallow enough water, they can physically move things across the site, or they can completely turn over a shipwreck. You know, if it's sitting up like this, a storm comes in, it could blow it over, it could turn it. I know there's some studies in the Keys that have documented the movement of big iron cannons. So there's a lot of energy, and all that energy is transforming these sites into a different site, essentially, that we then get to figure out the puzzle of what it looked like previously. So.
This is a really interesting conversation. I was in Yellowstone last week when their big floods came through, and to see some similar destructive situations that you've shown pictures of and explained happen on the shoreline is much closer to home.
Yeah, I can't imagine what's changed over there now.
Quite a bit. Mary Beth, would you like to talk about cemeteries? Excuse me, Melissa, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I will, yes. When people think about cemeteries and storms, they often think about things like this with coffins floating through the street sort of idea, and that does happen. That is something that's not going to be covered within our survey, because that is usually what falls under the local municipality and FEMA's jurisdiction to deal with this type of resource. So what we often deal with, in addition to the flooding and the erosion that Alison and Mary Beth had talked about, trees are a big deal. Cemeteries are sort of a special case, and why they're sort of grouped on their own, because not only are they archaeological sites, but they're also human remains. And that's a really important consideration, especially for our descendant communities. Nobody wants to know about their ancestors being exposed by these storms. And it's really problematic where, you know, you might have to replace a roof if a storm blows through, where a tree knocks into it. If a tree falls over in a cemetery, it might be doing a lot of additional damage. Trees tend to grow in a path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance in a cemetery is a grave. So when a tree falls over, like the ones you see on the screen that fell over during Florence and Beaufort, we're exposing potential human remains, and that is a big, not only cultural issue, but it could be a big ethical issue as well. Additionally, some of these big trees and plants that are destroyed or fall over, they might be what was used as a headstone. So if the tree is gone and it's not documented, it may be more difficult to identify an old grave, especially communities like enslaved communities where they didn't have formal markers. They did not purchase formal markers. They used what was at hand. And sometimes that was a specific plant use. And if a tree is gone, then locating that old grave will be almost impossible. And so it's important that we're able to get in there to not only identify these cemeteries and how they're being impacted, but also part of our project is to revisit cemeteries that we already know about to get sort of an idea of how this damage has it impacted the cemeteries, what are sort of the trends in the damage, so that we can help land managers predict and develop plans to counteract it in the future. But that's sort of the difference between the Shorescape Survey, which is informing the cemetery survey, but the cemetery survey also has that added impact of the human remains themselves, which is just something that needs to be thought of very seriously, because no one wants impacts to this type. It's not really a resource to impact these folks, which in turn help us understand where these communities were on the landscape and how they used the landscape in the past, which partners up with the stuff in the Shorescape survey. So it all feeds together. Just my added element is that we're actually having people impacted, their past, but they are human remains, and that's a serious concern for everyone.
What is the cultural or historical significance of the work that you do? Why is this really important to you to do this work?
I guess I'll go again. I will reshare my screen. Because some of these cemeteries are places for communities that don't exist anymore, whether on purpose or just through the passage of time. They've moved on, and the landscape has changed very dramatically, especially along the coastal region with development and the changing use of the coast. But also a lot of communities have been displaced because of this. And oftentimes the cemeteries can be the only part of the landscape still standing. The wooden structures from the fishing communities are gone. There's evidence in the ground, but the only thing above ground might be the cemetery, which is above and below the ground. And that is important because these cemeteries, like I said, some have been recorded, but some of them don't quite look like what people expect a cemetery is supposed to look like. Cemeteries can look like anything, but in North Carolina, we have a lot of interesting traditions that have partially survived along our coastal areas. And those can be tied to the way people were living, or different communities like the Gullah Geechee culture that stretches along the barrier islands and the coastal areas from North Carolina down through Florida. And we have one, for example, you see the picture on the left, and that's from the newly National Register listed cemetery, the John N. Smith Cemetery in Southport, North Carolina, where you can go there today and see this living examples of the Gullah Geechee funerary traditions in place. And that often involves the use of shells. We also see the use of artifacts, glassware, personal items, things like that, that may not be easily recognizable to someone who's used to the local community memorial gardens. And so it's important to be able to have people trained in this type of coastal archaeology to be able to go through these areas, to identify them, to actually pick them out on the landscape, because oftentimes they're overlooked. So this is our chance to capture this new data of these communities that haven't been investigated in the past. Sometimes though, these community cemeteries, especially associated with enslaved communities, they don't look like much at all. So the landscape clues are very settled. There may be rocks, there may be depressions like you see on the left-hand side. And those are things that will get really easily overlooked, especially by land managers who don't know what they're looking for. So Office of State Archaeology is here to help them identify these places that they may not have been aware actually exist. Because a lot of these places are cemeteries are sneaky. For example, this cemetery in Warren County, they had some graves that were marked with fieldstone markers. This is an enslaved community cemetery. And it looked like between the depressions and the fieldstones that there were about 60 to 75 folks buried there. But when the archaeologists came through and they did a ground penetrating radar study, there were closer to 300 people buried in that stand of trees. So there's a lot of potential for a lot of people and that need to be protected in the ground than what the surface shows. And so that's our hope as well, is if we identify, especially enslaved community cemetery, all cemeteries, but especially enslaved community cemeteries, if we can identify some of these to understand them better, our office does plan to use ground penetrating radar if it's possible, and if the area is good for ground penetrating radar. It's not great to use in all situations, but if it's good, we hope to be able to explore some of these areas to get a better understanding of what these cemeteries look like, so that we have to help us predict where to find other cemeteries along the coast and what they look like. So it's important to document how they're changing, but also to capture that information so we can share it with other land managers up and down the coast, including the ones that aren't in the current study area, because we'll get to them someday. It's just these are the ones we're focusing on right now.
Allison, how about you?
There we go. There's still so much we don't know about the history of North Carolina. A lot we can learn from the historical record, but I mean, as I was saying earlier, there's a lot that's on these maps and in written records that are like, they were in this general area doing like some very interesting things. But they don't give us specific locations, or they give us specific locations off of a tree, which trees change, as we've seen. So doing this work and finding, potentially finding these resources, particularly in these understudied areas, we can open a whole new avenue of research in North Carolina and complement work that's already been done in some cases. And I think in understanding how storms are impacting these resources or have impacted these resources, it can help inform policies, not just in coastal areas, but along waterways in, Yellowstone, for example. Like, you have resources and that's not something you're anticipating, but people on the coast are dealing with this daily with changing landscapes and changing sites, then the work we do here can hopefully help those people in areas that haven't thought about it yet. So I think it's really exciting. It's a new avenue of research that has been, since Hurricane Sandy, really gaining a lot of momentum, but it's very exciting to be a part of it and contribute to it.
I'll remind our viewers that if you have any questions, you can ask those in the chat feature, and we'll get to those in just a second. Mary Beth, would you bring us home with why this work is important to you?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, both Melissa and Allison have really given, great answers to that already. So yeah, I mean, I just think that, especially for the coastal area, what happened there in the early colonial period really set the stage for where we are today. I mean, there's no, way around that. The naval stores industry, especially, that without the shipyards, that we would not be where we're sitting right now. I mean, that whole industry and everything associated with it is of such historical importance. So, documenting some of those resources have been documented, and we know some about it, but like Allison was saying, there's still a lot more to learn. So I think, that's kind of partially why this work is so critical. And as Melissa mentioned, the Gullah-Geechee corridor, does extend into this project area. So for, cultural groups like the Gullah and other enslaved communities that were doing a lot of this early colonial industrial work, we know they existed, but their daily lives, what that entailed is primarily in the archaeological record. The kind of, when archaeology is nothing but the forensic analysis of past daily life. So these places that are along the coast where all these activities were actually happening, we can learn a lot about what it was like to be those people in the past. So I think that's, really why this work is important. And also for American Indians, we haven't talked about them as much, but of course they were living along the coast for thousands of years as well. Melissa did mention the concern for cemeteries. There's the concern for human remains. That's actually also a concern along the coast with regard to places where American Indians lived, especially produced shell middens, and in villages lived next to these areas, basically along the shore, and there are American Indian burials along the coast as well, so there are potential impacts for those. And of course, the coast was ground zero for colonization for So from the American Indian perspective, we'll also be documenting those sites, and we don't know, there's very little in the terms of written records about the folks who are living along the coast, because it happened so early in the colonial encounter, massacre, so genocide-ish activity. So because it happened so early, archaeology can really provide us a lot of information about what was happening back then. And there has been a lot of work done, but there's still a lot more to do. And then basically, so kind of all these things, the coastal sites are so important and they're so at risk with every, every storm that comes by, another piece of this puzzle is going away. And when we just know there's so many places that we don't know about, and that would be important to people. So that's why we are really interested to hear from folks. The Office of State Archaeology has actually a citizen science program. And we encourage folks to reach out to us because we know that we only know about a fraction, of the archaeological sites that are in the state and cemeteries, as Melissa mentioned. So we have a program where people can contact us about places they know about, and then we're happy to help them record them, because once we know where we are, then we can record them and learn about them and provide information about how best to steward these places. So I encourage folks to visit the site here. I kind of put the URL up there, archaeology@ncdcr.gov.
As the project continues and moves forward, are there other places that folks can go for more information or resources or progress updates as the project moves forward?
Yeah, we will. It's actually under construction right now, but we're going to be having a web page on our main website that you see here. So there'll be under one of the tabs, there'll be a tab for this research. So it'll be actually about climate change and archaeological sites more generally, but it'll have information about this project and how it's progressing as well. So
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Do any of you have a final word for our viewers? It doesn't look like we have any outside questions at this point, but if you have a final word, now is your opportunity.
I just think it's exciting because, kind of backing off what Alison was saying, that this is giving us a chance to not only protect and learn and manage these places, but also celebrate all of these really cool North Carolina communities that have not gotten the fanfare that they have had in the past. All these traditions and uses of the landscape is just a really exciting sort of flag in the DNCR cap to be able to show off all these cool places. So really, if you do know anything about any sites or cemeteries, even if they're not within the project area, we'd like to add that knowledge to the way we're helping to promote and celebrate these places, because we do plan on having town hall meetings and exhibits and events at some of these locations where we're doing these projects. And we'd love to make sure that you tell us and come out and see it, and whenever we can manage to arrange that as well.
Well, I'd like to extend a very large and exciting thank you to our panelists today for describing your work, and we wish you the best of luck as you continue on these projects. Thank you so much for joining us today.